Welcome back to the Quickstart Guide for Recovery from Addiction and Co-Occurring Disorders. We're going to continue talking about preventing and mitigating negative triggers. I'm your host, Dr. Dawn-Elise Snipes. Again, we're going to continue talking about mitigating, reducing the impact of physical, affective, cognitive, environmental, and relational triggers. And we're going to talk about ways to figure out what you need to do to prevent some of those triggers from ever happening, and what to do if they actually do happen to prevent them from triggering a full-blown relapse. We've already talked about physical and affective triggers. In this section, we're talking about cognitive triggers. In addiction recovery, we call this stinking thinking or unhelpful thinking styles. Some of the most common cognitive triggers or cognitive errors are what we call cognitive distortions, thinking you can control everything or nothing. And one of the best ways to deal with this, whenever you have this feeling that you can't control anything or you've got everything licked, is to identify what parts of any situation you can and cannot control. In terms of your recovery, there are things that you can control and things that you can't. You can get good sleep, you can get good nutrition, you can practice your meditations. There are lots of things you can do. But, maybe somebody that you have a relatively adversarial relationship with comes along and, starts poking the bear and stirs up a lot of negative feelings within you. Well, you can't control that person. You can't control what they're going to say. You can't control how much exposure you have to them, and you can control how you react in their presence, whether you permit them to stir up your emotions or whether you leave the situation. So there are always parts of situations that you can control and parts that you cannot. Another common thinking issue is all or nothing thinking. Thinking that, every time I try to get clean and sober, or every time I start feeling better, then the bottom falls out. Look for exceptions. There are generally exceptions to the rule. They may be small exceptions, but there are exceptions. For example, when, working with people in addiction recovery, they may do really well and they may have, a period of 2, 3, 6 months, 6 years of sobriety, and then they relapse. Okay. Does that mean that they always fail at relapse or at recovery? No, it doesn't. We want to look for exceptions. And one of the exceptions is the fact that they had a period of sobriety in there. Now, obviously there was a problem because they relapsed, but instead of thinking of it as all or nothing, I'm either clean forever or I'm addicted forever. Looking at those clean times and going, okay, they're getting longer, they're getting stronger. It's just a matter of figuring out how to prevent those bumps in the road that lead to relapse. Same thing for depression. All or nothing thinking. When people have depression or they're in a depressive episode, they may feel like they are always depressed. Now, even people in the middle of a clinical depressive episode sometimes will have these little glimmers of not depression. They may not be elated, but they have these little glimmers during the day where, things were okay, or it didn't feel so bad for a moment. And that's where I want you to focus. Remember to find exceptions to the extremes. It may not be perfect. Like I said, you may not have an hour during the day where you just felt giddy, but you may have an hour during the day or even 30 minutes during the day where you felt, okay. And that's progress. You want to build off of that and ask yourself what was different during that period. Catastrophizing, making a mountain out of a molehill. It's important to examine the facts and the probability that whatever you believe is going to happen or has happened is actually what is going to happen or has happened. You can believe that, okay, you lost your job, which means you're not going to be able to pay your rent, which means you're going to be homeless, and in 6 months you're going to be living on the street. Well, okay, there's a possibility that could happen. But what is the probability? Look at your resources in the community, with your friends. What are the chances that it's going to get to the point where you're actually living on the street versus, crashing on somebody's couch? Or maybe even it won't get that far and, you talk to your landlord and you get a little bit of time until you get a new job to pay the rent. There are a lot of things that can happen between right now and that catastrophic end result. Look at the facts. How realistic is it what you're thinking? And what is the probability that the worst case scenario is actually going to happen? A lot of people in addiction recovery, for example, have some criminal charges that they still have to answer for. Not all people, not even the majority, but there are still a lot of people. One of the big fears that they have is having to, go to jail, having to go to prison, and what that might look like. And it's important to look at the facts. What is the probability that they're going to have to go to prison for an extended period of time versus maybe be on work release or something like that. Personalization means taking everything personally. If somebody walks down the street and looks at you wrong, you think, oh my gosh, they don't like me or they're mad at me. Personalization is often flawed because most of the time other people's reactions to you have a lot more to do with them than with you, because most of us are caught up in our own head most of the time. So identify 3 other explanations for why that might have happened. If you're at the grocery store, for example, and the cashier is particularly unpleasant that day, you could think, well, she must have something against me. What's her problem? Or you might try to find 3 other options or 3 other explanations for why she's in such an awful mood. Maybe she crashed her car on the way to work. Maybe her dog died. Maybe she got written up at work. Those are 3 reasons that she might be in an awful mood and be rude to you because she's in an awful mood that have nothing to do with you. Emotional reasoning is when we think we know what's going on based on how we feel. And the 2 examples I usually give when I talk about emotional reasoning are planes and snakes. Some people are terrified of flying because they think it might be scary. And if it's scary, then it must be dangerous. And they don't have any facts about how many planes actually crash or how airplanes actually fly and how safe it is versus driving or other things like that. They're merely going on their gut. They're looking and going, if God meant us to fly, he'd give us wings. Emotional reasoning can cause people to be afraid of things for which in a situation where there's really no factual basis for that fear. Snakes are the other example. Yes, there are some poisonous snakes out there, but there are very few compared to the number of non-poisonous snakes out there. So if you see a snake and you immediately get afraid and think you've got to run away or escape or avoid that snake, that's emotional reasoning. You don't have the facts about that particular snake and, what it's thinking. A lot of times, like when I go out hiking, there will be snakes in the middle of the trail. And a lot of times they're not looking for me. They're not out hunting prey. They are harmless little non-poisonous snakes that are sunbathing, and they're trying to raise their body temperature. It has nothing to do with me. Emotional reasoning, if I'm using it, would cause me to be very afraid and maybe not even want to go hiking anymore. Factual reasoning, I go through the facts in my head because I've educated myself about some of the characteristics, like the head shape of poisonous snakes. I look at the snake and I go, yeah, that's not a poisonous snake. And I also note that, hey, Mr. Snake is sunning himself. So that means he's not out here looking for me. He's trying to warm up and, walk around him. I don't walk over him or poke him or something, but there really is no factual basis for me to be scared. We use emotional reasoning in our relationships. We use emotional reasoning a lot. And it's important to get the facts and then make your decision. Negative perceptions and attitude can also be an unhelpful thinking style. If you tend to look at the world as a glass half empty sort of thing, if you always see the negative, always see the downside, you're always waiting for that other shoe to fall, guess what? You're going to be pretty daggum unhappy. And that goes back to those affective triggers, which is going to probably trigger your anxiety, your depression, and maybe your addiction more often than if you have a positive attitude. Try to make lemonade and look at the big picture. And when we get into the units on addressing cognitions, you're going to learn a lot of techniques to deal with those things. But try to find the silver lining. For right now, I'm just going to give you that one tool. If it's raining outside and I wanted to, go out and go running or whatever, okay, I'm probably not going to go running in the rain. It would keep me cooler, but probably not going to do it. But it means that I don't have to pay to water my garden because Mother Nature's doing it for me. It means that I don't have to pay to wash my car because, again, Mother Nature's doing it for me. I just have to go out there with a rag afterwards and wipe it off. So I try to find the positives even in situations that may not be my preference. And then mind reading. And they say that when you try to read other people's minds, you're assuming you know what they're thinking. And when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. ASSUME. Assume. So it's all right in the word when we talk about assuming. So stop assuming. Stop thinking that you know what other people are thinking. Ask. Ask what they're thinking. Even if you think you know what their intent was. Ask. That will prevent so many problems and so much conflict. Activities for this section. Think about how can each of the following be a trigger for addiction, depression, anxiety, or anger. So how can each one of these unhelpful thinking styles be a trigger for addiction, depression, anxiety, or anger? Back to those 4 columns again. And how can you prevent or minimize each one? How can you prevent or minimize thinking that you have to be in control over everything or that you're not in control of anything? Obviously I gave you some tips right here for ways that you can do it. But thinking about steps that you can take to start addressing some of these unhelpful thinking styles. And then what can you do to remind yourself to evaluate your thoughts and address them as needed? We have these unhelpful thoughts throughout the day. So how can you remind yourself, or how can you start being more mindful of what you're thinking in the moment so you can address them as they come up? It's going to be different for every single person, but it is important to notice, to start becoming more aware of your physical clues that you're becoming irritable, impatient, depressed, and identify, what might be causing that, and start checking, am I having thoughts that are unhelpful? What feelings am I feeling right now, and what's contributing to those, and what can I do to minimize those? Your thoughts and memories will trigger emotional and physical responses. Stinking thinking, or unhelpful thoughts, is often characterized by unhelpful thinking styles. It's important to keep your thinking interventions with you because, like I said, you'll have these unhelpful thoughts throughout the day. So keep a list of things that you're going to do to minimize or mitigate the impact of these negative thoughts. Keep it with you. For example, go back here. Maybe you have a list that you keep with you of identify what parts of any situation you can and cannot control. Remember to look for exceptions. Remember to examine the facts and the probability. And identify 3 other explanations for why this may be happening. Stop assuming and try to find the silver lining or make lemonade. When you're feeling distressed, check for unhelpful thinking styles. And before you make decisions, check your thinking. Sometimes your thinking can be clouded by overly optimistic thoughts. Like I said, that thinking that you've got everything under control. So it's important to examine your thinking before you make decisions and when you're feeling distressed in order to make sure that you are continuing to do the next right thing to be as happy and healthy as you can be.